There's a specific kind of frustration that doesn't have a clean name. It's the feeling you get when someone who's clearly in over their head is giving orders to people who clearly aren't. When you're sitting in that meeting, that briefing, that classroom, watching someone make the wrong call with complete confidence, and you can see exactly why it's wrong, and there's nothing you can do about it because they outrank you. You know that feeling. Most people do. Here's what might actually surprise you. That feeling is not new. It's not a modern failure. It's not getting worse because of politics or broken institutions or whatever came up in the news this week. It has been the defining frustration of organized human life for literally thousands of years. The wrong people end up in charge. The capable people sit below them and wonder what they're supposed to do about it. And Niccolò Machiavelli, a man who spent his entire life being destroyed by exactly this problem, had a lot to say about it. Not the version of Machiavelli you've seen quoted in posts about being ruthless and calculating. The real one. The one who was physically tortured, thrown out of the city he'd spent 14 years faithfully serving, and stripped of everything he'd built, and who responded to all of that not with rage, but with one of the most coldly precise analyses of power ever written. And more than any of that, we're going to talk about what all of it means for you, wherever you're sitting today, in whatever situation has you watching someone beneath you, inability make decisions above you in rank. This isn't a video about complaining. This is a video about strategy. Because the question has never been whether incompetent people will end up with power over you. They will. The real question is, what do you do when they do? Before we get into the strategy, we need to understand the problem itself because most people have it wrong. If you think incompetent leadership is some modern failure, a product of bad elections or broken company culture, you've dramatically underestimated how ancient this pattern really is. Machiavelli wrote The Prince in 1513 for a world of dukes, popes, and military commanders. And yet, nearly every observation he made maps almost perfectly onto a modern boardroom or government ministry. That's not a coincidence. That's because human nature hasn't changed. What Machiavelli found, sitting in that Tuscan exile, is that power rarely goes to the most capable person. It goes to the most strategic one. Think about what actually moves someone upward in most institutions. Is it raw ability? Yes, to a point, but only to a point. After that threshold, what carries people higher is something far more social and far more uncomfortable. How much the people above them like them, how loyal they appear, and most critically, how safe and unthreatened they make powerful people feel. And here's the brutal irony. Highly intelligent people are often terrible at all three. They challenge the plan. They spot the flaw everyone else missed. They ask the inconvenient question that makes their superiors feel outmaneuvered. They become a threat, usually without even meaning to. And here's the part that should genuinely make you angry. Researchers who study leadership have actually documented this. What they found is that intelligence helps up to a certain point. Past that point, it starts working against you. Not because smart people are worse leaders in practice, they're often far better, but because the people doing the choosing aren't always looking for the best leader. They're looking for the one who makes them feel comfortable, the one they can predict, the one they don't feel threatened by. Let that land for a second. The system doesn't just fail to pick the best people, it actively filters them out, and it has been doing this for a very long time. Machiavelli put it plainly. Those in power surround themselves with people who make them look good, not people who actually are good. He even gave you a way to diagnose it instantly. In The Prince, he wrote, "The first method for estimating the intelligence of a ruler is to look at the men he has around him. He's not just describing a pattern, he's handing you a test. Look at who they've chosen to keep close. That tells you everything. The genuinely capable ones either learn very quickly to hide it, or they get pushed out entirely. So here you are. You see through the theater. You're surrounded by a system that seems designed to reward the wrong people. What did the smart ones throughout history actually do about it? The first move Machiavelli recommended is the one that'll feel most wrong to almost anyone who's been told their whole life to speak up, stand out, and fight for their seat at the table. He said, "Make yourself less threatening, not invisible in the sense of doing nothing, less threatening in the sense of not becoming a target. We're told constantly to make our intelligence known, to be direct, to claim the recognition we deserve. And in a genuinely fair environment, that's good advice. But in environments where mediocre leadership has consolidated power, that same instinct can be genuinely dangerous. Power that feels insecure doesn't respond to a challenge with admiration or reflection. It responds with removal. Machiavelli gave a name to the capacity to read a situation clearly and act within its real constraints, not the constraints you wish existed. He called it virtù, which doesn't mean virtue in the moral sense. Think of it as practical wisdom, knowing when to push, when to pull back, and when to make yourself completely useful while appearing completely unambitious. He described it in The Prince with an image that stayed with me. The lion cannot protect himself from traps, and the fox cannot defend himself from wolves. One must therefore be a fox to recognize traps, and a lion to frighten wolves. Most people default to one or the other. The intelligent person learns to read which moment requires which. Right now, in the conditions we're describing, it's fox time. For the capable person trapped under incompetent authority, this often looks like restraint, choosing not to correct someone publicly, even when they're wrong, framing your best idea as something the person in charge had already been thinking. It looks from the outside like you're underperforming. From the inside, it's the most calculated thing you can do. The historical example here is Francis Walsingham, who served Queen Elizabeth I in 16th century England. Most people have never heard of him, but Walsingham was arguably the most consequential strategic mind of the entire Elizabethan era. He built England's first real intelligence network from scratch. He uncovered multiple assassination plots against the Queen. He ran international espionage operations at a level that wouldn't be matched for another century. By any measure, the man was extraordinary. And yet, Walsingham was obsessive about one thing, never appearing more capable than Elizabeth herself. He framed every success as flowing from her wisdom. Every initiative was presented as her instinct and execution, not his planning. He made her feel commanding and decisive, even when the actual thinking was entirely his own. Think about what that actually required of him. One of the most brilliant strategic operators of his era spent his career making sure almost no one fully knew it. He survived, he built, he mattered. And notice something. Elizabeth I was not an incompetent ruler. She was sharp, politically astute, and effective by almost any historical measure. The point isn't that this strategy only works under bad leadership. It's that if appearing non-threatening is wise even under capable authority, it becomes absolutely essential under incompetent authority where the ego is more fragile, and the response to perceived threats is less rational and more dangerous. Sometimes the price of staying in the room is letting someone else stand in the spotlight. Watching your insight get credited to someone less capable, staying quiet when you know the room is about to walk off a cliff, biting your tongue when everything in you wants to just say the thing. That is not painless. It accumulates. But Machiavelli was clear about the trade-off. Restraint isn't about feeling good. It's about staying in a position to eventually matter. And the alternative, confronting insecure power before the conditions are right, almost never ends the way you hope. Conditions do change, though. They always change. And when they do, the person who's still in the room is the one with the leverage. Strategic restraint buys you time. It doesn't win anything on its own. Machiavelli was blunt about this. The person who simply waits passively for power to come to them deserves to wait forever. So what do you actually do with the time you've bought? You build real influence. Not the formal kind, not the title or the credit or the nameplate on the door. The actual kind. The trust, the network, the knowledge, the reputation of being the person who gets things done when it matters. Here's a distinction Machiavelli made that almost nobody talks about. The difference between formal power and effective power. Formal power is the rank and the office. Effective power is what people actually need from you. In any organization where incompetence has risen to the top, these two things are almost always separated. The capable person's job is to quietly accumulate the second kind while appearing completely uninterested in the first. And what do intelligent people typically have that their incompetent superiors lack? They know how things actually work. Their colleagues trust them. They're the people others come to when something needs to be done correctly and quietly. These are currencies, and currencies in a long game outlast titles every single time. The most dramatic illustration of this is Cardinal Richelieu, who served as chief minister to King Louis XIII of France in the early 1600s. Louis XIII wasn't unintelligent exactly, but he was emotionally unstable, deeply insecure, and genuinely not built for the brutal daily work of running a country. Richelieu saw this clearly, and rather than positioning himself as the more capable man, which would have meant his immediate destruction, he built an entire architecture of influence around the king. Richelieu controlled what information reached Louis. He shaped how every major decision was framed. He managed the vicious internal politics of the French nobility and the complex chess game of European diplomacy, all while staging every outcome so that Louis felt he was doing the ruling. The actual governing was Richelieu. The credit went to the king. When Richelieu died in 1642, his successor Mazarin stepped into the framework Richelieu had built and used it to guide France through the turbulent early years of the young Louis XIV. One man's quiet architecture of influence outlasted him and shaped a generation of history he never lived to see. Have you ever seen a version of this up close? Someone who was never the loudest person in the room, never chasing the title, but who somehow ended up being the one person the whole organization quietly depended on. That's not an accident. That's exactly what this looks like from the outside. The practical shape of this matters too. This kind of influence is built through specific, unglamorous habits. Being the person who solves the problem nobody else wanted to touch. Giving credit to others freely and keeping the relationships. Being reliably useful when things go wrong without needing to announce it. None of that feels heroic in the moment. It's exactly how the people who ultimately matter the most end up mattering. Now here's the part of this that most people find genuinely uncomfortable. I'd rather be direct about it than talk around it. Machiavelli noticed something about human psychology that's still hard to say out loud. Ego is often more powerful than reason, and people who've risen beyond their actual competence share one nearly universal trait. They're terrified of being exposed. Not criticized, not fired, exposed. The deepest fear of someone who's risen past what they can actually do is that the people around them will finally fully see through the performance. And because that fear runs so deep, almost everything they do is organized around preventing it. They surround themselves with people who agree with them. They punish the person who asks the inconvenient question. They take credit for successes and push blame downward when things fail. These are not random personality quirks. They're completely predictable, completely consistent patterns of self-protection. And once you can see them clearly, you can work with them instead of walking into them blind. Machiavelli actually wrote a line in The Prince that gets at the heart of why insecure leaders are so volatile. He said, "There is no other way to guard yourself against flattery than by making men understand that telling you the truth will not offend you." Read that carefully. He's describing a capability. The leader who can actually do that, who can genuinely receive the truth without feeling attacked by it, doesn't need to punish the person who delivers it. Their ego is stable enough to handle reality. But the leaders we're talking about in this video can't do that. They never built that capacity. And so they respond to honesty the way a cornered animal responds to anything unexpected, with aggression. This is the environment you're operating in. And the most important rule inside it is, never mistake the ego's fragility for weakness. A fragile ego in a powerful position is one of the most dangerous things in any human organization. Now I want to tell you about Galileo, because the real story is not the one most people know. In 1632, Galileo published what he intended to be his masterwork, a book-length debate meant to prove, once and for all, that the Earth moves around the sun. He was right. He had the data, the observations, and the mathematics to prove it beyond serious dispute. He also had, at that specific moment, the personal friendship and support of Pope Urban VIII, one of the most powerful men in Europe, who had actually championed Galileo's career for years. What Galileo didn't have was political intelligence. He structured the book as a three-way dialogue. The character arguing for the Earth going around the sun was sharp, articulate, and always correct. The character defending the old view that the Earth sits at the center of the universe was a bumbling figure called Simplicio. In Italian, Simplicio means roughly the simple one, and Urban VIII's own private theological arguments against heliocentrism, arguments he had shared with Galileo in personal conversations he thought were confidential, were placed almost word for word into Simplicio's mouth. The Pope felt that Galileo had called him a simpleton in public in front of all of educated Europe, using his own words. It didn't matter that Galileo was right about the science. It didn't matter that he'd spent decades building a careful, meticulous case. He had walked directly into the most predictable trap in the history of power. He had publicly humiliated the ego of an insecure man who held absolute authority. Galileo was tried by the Inquisition and spent the final 9 years of his life under house arrest, forbidden to publish. Now here's the part of the story that actually matters for you. Other scientists of the same era were working with the same ideas. They saw the same data. They published cautiously. They framed their findings as extensions of existing knowledge rather than attacks on it. They dedicated their papers to powerful patrons and made their discoveries available in ways that let powerful people feel they were on the right side of things, rather than being dragged there against their will. They advanced science. They kept their freedom. Machiavelli wasn't telling you to be dishonest. The ego doesn't care that you're correct. Feed it where it cost you nothing. Give the person in charge their moment. Let the decision feel like theirs. And then do the actual work that matters. Everything we've talked about so far assumes you're playing a long game, restraint, building real influence quietly, patience. But Machiavelli was equally honest about the limits of patience. He wrote about fortune as a force that governs roughly half of human affairs. The other half, the part that determines whether any of this actually means anything, is controlled by your ability to act decisively when the moment is genuinely right. The key phrase being, genuinely right. So how do you know when the moment has come? Machiavelli identified a few reliable signals. The first is a shift in the loyalties of the people around the incompetent leader. Bad leadership always eventually alienates someone who matters, a key person, a critical group inside the organization. When those people begin to quietly distance themselves, something structural is usually changing underneath. The second signal is when the failures become undeniable, not just to the capable observers who always saw them, but to the people above the leader, to the board, to the institution, to the public. The third signal is the hardest one to sit with, when the cost of continued waiting is now greater than the cost of acting. The clearest example of timing done wrong is the long campaign against Robert Walpole, who served as Britain's first effective prime minister and dominated British politics for over 20 years in the early 18th century. Walpole was powerful, openly ruthless, and had brilliant enemies who attacked him relentlessly. Jonathan Swift, the writer who gave us Gulliver's Travels, spent years targeting him through political satire. Alexander Pope, one of the sharpest poets in the English language, went after him in verse that still reads as devastating today. The attacks were creative and well-aimed. They accomplished almost nothing, because they moved before the ground had actually shifted. Walpole's own allies could still justify supporting him, so he survived every campaign, every parliamentary challenge, every pamphlet and satirical poem thrown at him. When he finally fell in 1742, it wasn't because his enemies had pushed harder. It was because the underlying conditions had moved far enough that his own people could no longer hold the line. Fortune had shifted, and the people who had spent those years positioning themselves correctly were the ones who stepped into the space. Ask yourself honestly if you're inside a situation like this right now. Are you feeling urgency because the moment is actually right, or because the frustration has finally become unbearable? Those two things feel almost identical from the inside. They produce very different results. The intelligent person's biggest vulnerability is impatience. There's a rage that builds, slowly and completely justifiably, when you watch incompetence be rewarded and capability be overlooked for long enough. Machiavelli felt this himself. He gave 14 years of real service to the Florentine Republic, built genuine diplomatic skill and institutional knowledge, and when the Medici came back to power and the regime changed, none of it mattered. He was arrested. He was tortured. He was nobody. What did he do? He didn't attack his enemies before he had any ground to stand on. He didn't rage publicly. He went to his small farm in Tuscany, read classical history late into the night, and wrote The Prince. He took the experience of being completely crushed by power and turned it into one of the most enduring works of political thought in history. 500 years later, we're still reading his words. The men who ordered his torture are footnotes. Anger is a signal. It is not a strategy. Most people who use the word Machiavellian mean cold, scheming, and unprincipled. But here's something almost no one knows. Machiavelli was actually a lifelong Republican. He believed in civic life, in engaged citizens, in governments that genuinely served the people under them. The Prince wasn't his vision of how the world should work. It was his unsentimental account of how the world actually does work, written specifically for the capable and principled person who has to navigate it without being destroyed by it. He wasn't writing a manual for tyrants. He was writing a survival guide for everyone else. Once you understand that, everything in this video looks different. The restraint, the patience, the careful management of ego, it's not cynicism. It's the price of staying in a position to eventually change something. And the historical examples of people who paid that price and came out the other side are extraordinary. Think about Nelson Mandela. Mandela was imprisoned for 27 years by South Africa's apartheid government, spending 18 of those years on Robben Island before being moved to other prisons, a government that understood on some level that his actual crime was being too effective. During those years, he did something that looks from the outside like passive endurance. It was anything but. Mandela learned Afrikaans in prison, the language of his captors and of the apartheid government itself, and used it to study them, their fears, their internal contradictions, the fractures in their system that might eventually be pried open. He read widely, including works on military strategy and political negotiation. He built relationships even inside prison with guards and wardens who later testified publicly to his character and his consistency. And he refused, with sustained deliberate effort, to perform bitterness. That was a choice, not a spiritual accident, a strategic decision made over years. He understood that bitterness would have made him a symbol of grievance, someone a frightened and divided country couldn't actually follow. What he needed to be when the moment came was something different entirely. When South Africa's conditions finally shifted, when international isolation made the apartheid regime impossible to sustain, Mandela emerged with moral authority that his enemies couldn't touch, and credibility across communities that should have been impossible to bridge. He didn't overpower the system, he outlasted it, and he was exactly what was needed the moment it collapsed. Mandela said something about this that sounds almost too simple until you sit with it long enough. He said, "It always seems impossible until it's done." That's not a comfort. That's an observation about how every system that has ever looked unbeatable from the inside looked exactly that way right up until the moment it wasn't. The impossibility is not permanent, it is a phase. Now I want to tell you about one more person, and I'll ask you to stay with me even if the name means nothing to you yet, because the story is worth it. When the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 AD, the world didn't simply go dark overnight. The machinery of Roman governance didn't just vanish. Administrators and scholars who'd built their careers inside Roman institutions kept working under new and uncertain authority, carrying the knowledge and habits of the old world through a transition that might otherwise have been complete chaos. One of the most important of these figures was a Roman senator named Cassiodorus. He served under Theodoric, the Ostrogothic king who ruled Italy after Rome's fall, and ran the civil administration of the kingdom using the legal systems and institutional practices of classical Rome. He kept things functioning when they had every reason to collapse. Then, later in life, he founded a monastery in southern Italy called the Vivarium, and spent his remaining years directing monks to copy and preserve classical manuscripts, including philosophical, scientific, and literary texts that would otherwise have been lost to history entirely, not just for his generation, for all of history. More than 1,000 years later, the Renaissance drew on texts that survived because Cassiodorus put his head down, served under authority he hadn't chosen, and focused on preserving what actually mattered rather than performing a resistance that would have cost him everything and saved nothing. The deeper game is remaining capable and productive and positioned through the difficult period, so that when conditions change, as they always do, you are the person with something real to offer. So where does all of this actually leave you? You are sitting somewhere today, watching someone who doesn't deserve the authority they have exercised it over people who do. We've established that this feeling is ancient, that it's not your personal failure, and that the most effective people in history navigated it not through righteous confrontation, but through strategy. Here's the part I want you to carry with you. The frustration you feel is not evidence that the system is unbeatable. It's evidence that you can see clearly. That clarity is your actual asset. Don't burn it on anger before the conditions are right, and watch for the shift. It always comes. The people who've positioned themselves correctly during the hard period are the ones who define what comes next. Not the loudest, not the most visibly righteous, the ones who were still standing. Machiavelli didn't write The Prince from a position of power. He wrote it after losing almost everything, from a small farm in Tuscany with nothing left but his ability to see clearly, and his refusal to stop thinking. He converted humiliation into insight so precise that we're still reading it 5 centuries later. The men who had him tortured are footnotes in someone else's story. That is not a small thing. That might be everything. If you've been in a situation like the ones we talked about today, working under authority that felt completely unearned, I want to know what you did. Drop it in the comments. The real wisdom on this question lives in those experiences, not just in history books. And if this video found the right person, pass it on, including to someone who'd push back on every word of it. Not to win anything, just to share a question that's been worth asking for 500 years and see what conclusion they come to. Like, if Machiavelli surprised you. Subscribe for more of this. History, psychology, and the uncomfortable truths about how the world actually works. I'll see you in the next one.